We're running Exchange today.
VMware now runs all its Exchange in VCloud Air. So as Pat was saying about eating our own dog food, maybe not our champagne, then if you think about what we're doing, then we always 100% try and eat our own dog food by designing our own architectures. And on that, kind of shameless plug from another session I'm doing, I actually have a session tomorrow or Wednesday, well, I'm losing track of the days, on how to actually design and architect Exchange for the hybrid cloud. So please come along if you're interested.
We've actually got some of those listed at the end of the presentation, so we'll put that up so you can take a picture of it. This one's actually interesting, and again, to point out some of the other sessions that are going on that tie back to some of this, there's a session, I think it's on Wednesday. It's called Smells Like Team Spirits, Jay Marshall. He's going to touch very much on these building next generation applications piece. So what we're trying to do as a tech marketing team is you'll see presentations that mirror and match each other and kind of blend together so you can get a picture of this.
So this slide's kind of important because we want you to try and free your mind in the matrix sense of everything that you know today. So when you're thinking about building your hybrid cloud, as Chris was saying, the important point to note is it's exactly the same considerations that you want to take to build a hybrid cloud that you would when you're building your own on-premises data center. The key thing to remember is, even though it's virtualized and you apparently lives out in the cloud and you don't actually ever get to sit there hugging the servers under your desk and giving them a polish on a night, it's still critical to consider the security and the networking and the implications you have around that. And we'll talk a little bit more about it, but imagine you open a firewall in your cloud, set the rules to any, and then you put everything there. It's in the cloud, it's safe. No, it's not. Okay. There's a point here that's really important. Forget everything you know about ESXi to a point. So one of the big topics that we have when we're talking about cloud is the fact that people are like, well, I have no access to vCenter. I can't get to the ESXi host to mount my NFS. Well, no, you can't because it's cloud. The whole purpose of cloud is you're buying an SLA for compute, storage, and networking. You're not buying the hardware and managing it yourself. Okay? So try and forget about what you do today with ESXi from a cloud perspective. You're looking at the higher layer of your networking constructs and moving up a level. So we can kind of, what was that Leonardo DiCaprio movie where you do all the different layers? Inception.
Yeah. How many of you today are actually working on DevOps or focusing on learning DevOps? It's like one guy.
Go to Jay Marshall's session, you'll love it.
Well, so I come from an ESX world, right? So I don't want this to scare people, but we've been saying this for a while, right? As you start to move to different architectures and you start to move into things like a hybrid data center, you're not managing ESX. The days of going in and troubleshooting logs and things like that, you're paying for the SLA for someone else to do that, whether it's us or another cloud provider, right? That's the key, is you can focus on building applications and getting things to market for your organization faster and deploying infrastructure or deploying applications versus infrastructure. It's about the application now, not the infrastructure.
So going forward, I want to talk a little bit about how you can actually understand the VCloud Air Structure. So we have the tenant portal. That's the UI that you guys come in and consume all the resources through. We also have API, so you can do it through command line, but essentially we have the portal sitting at the top. We have today 2 cloud offerings. So we have the dedicated cloud, which is your physically isolated environment. They're your own hosts. Remember what we said about the previous slide, though, about you don't get access to ESXi. So they are dedicated for you, but you don't get to manage the actual underlying hypervisor. And then we have a virtual private cloud, which is our multi-tenant cloud offering. So the resources are shared with other consumers, but you have a lower cost. And then we use our vCloud network and security edge gateways to provide you with the edge core network, so the firewall routing and the load balancing and stuff that we'll talk about a bit later on. So that's a very high level of how the service is put together. So an important point, the single sign-on to all your clouds. So it doesn't matter whether you've got resources in the UK, whether you've got them in New Jersey or in Japan. You log in to the same portal URL with the same account and you access all those resources. So it's the same login as well for any VCloud API that you use. And then you can manage and create additional users as you see fit. An important point to note is the very first user, which, as you probably expect, becomes like the Uber admin. So the first guy that logs in and creates everything is Mr. Uber admin, and then you can change the roles and rights and permissions after that. You also get the ability to manage data protection options, which is our core service offering around backup in the cloud. And another shameless plug, Chris and I have a recovery as a service session on tomorrow, I think, and that's all about how we do disaster recovery and data protection within the cloud. And then you log in to access My VMware, where you can spin up more resources and put in orders for more compute, more storage. So I was talking about dedicated cloud. What actually is dedicated cloud? Well, as I said, it's a physically isolated environment, so it's your own hosts, it's your own management stack, so you get your own vCloud director, and this is physically isolated for you. It's not shared with other customers, so the hosts are yours. So this is key to understand when you're thinking about licensing your applications. How many people in here run Oracle databases? How many people like licensing that product? You've got shares in Oracle. So when you think about Oracle, and it's a great example to talk about this, is for Oracle databases, you have to license that product for every processor that that product potentially can run on. So if you think you spin that up in a shared cloud, and potentially there could be 60 hosts in there, they could be spanning multiple clusters, however we've architected it on the back end, you have no exposure to that. So when you think about those processors, trying to license for that is going to be complicated and also very expensive. A dedicated cloud, however, because it's physically isolated, you're the only one running on it as well, allows you to actually calculate how many processors are in there. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you size these environments in a few slides. But ultimately, you can control how many processors you have within your clusters, much in the same way you would do if you were designing it on premises. So we're going back to that consideration that even though it's in the cloud, the same considerations apply. With a dedicated cloud, you get multiple edge gateways. So you can spin up as many edge gateways as you want and have these sitting on the internet, providing services to applications that you have. So a virtual private cloud, as I was saying, is our multi-tenant cloud offering. So this is shared hosts. So when you think about that licensing, it gives you limited mobility with your applications, because most vendors don't allow you to bring your own licenses to shared environments. So you have to buy licenses. Like Microsoft's a great example. They do what's called a service provider licensing agreement, so SPLA licenses. You have to buy those licenses from the service provider to run your applications and OSs in that shared cloud. You do get the benefits of a lower cost entry point with a virtual private cloud. You can imagine buying your own host is more expensive than sharing those hosts with other tenants. The key difference is you only get one edge gateway. So you buy a virtual private cloud, you only get one edge gateway. So if you've got multiple web servers, for example, and you want to open port 80 to all those different services, you're only going to have one one edge gateway. So it's going to be challenging to try and get port 80 to go to these different service tiers. So we do have a new offering that Bill Fathers announced today in the keynote, our virtual private cloud on demand. So this is where you can actually go and spin up resources with your credit card and pay for the usage that you need for those particular virtual machines and workloads. Whereas the previous two offerings I showed you were subscription-based, this is more a just spin up and go and do what I want, pay-as-you-go model.
So who's already signed up for the beta?
Awesome.
Why haven't the rest of you? Go for it. Yeah. Sign up now, because get in early.
So we'll bring this slide up again later, and you'll see this URL around. Also, another thing that I wanted to point out very quickly, Vic, stand up, please. So for the best question today, we have these really cool VCloud Air
Come on up here,
shirts.
Vic.
You twirl, there we go.
There's a nice little Dilbert graphic on it. We actually have some, you said we have some to give away. Right?
Yeah, so I've got quite a few of these to give away. So for the best question that we get today, you'll get a t-shirt. So, cool. You can look like that guy.
Thank you, Vic.
Thanks, Vic. You're awesome. So as I was saying, we were talking about the Edge Gateway, and a key consideration about the Edge Gateway is to treat it like your advanced core switch. This is the edge of your virtual data center. So much in the same way that you treat the edge of your physical data center, you would control and build the rules and everything in this firewall in exactly the same way. With the Edge Gateway, you get 10 total interfaces, so you actually get 9 to consume to create routable networks within that virtual data center. So you can see here the example shows you a few routed networks. And then you can spin up to 20 isolated networks within that virtual data center as well. So you can build some nice custom networking that helps you replicate what you do on premises in the cloud environment. We also have like advanced features like DHCP, load balancing, and static routing, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as time goes on. Chris?
So just real quick to go back to this one. Although it's a firewall and it's on the edge, this does give routing capability between the networks that you assign to each of those interfaces. So this is why I go back to think about how you do networking today. The difference is this is your core switch. It's your core firewall. It's basically L3 through L7, right? And everything is licensed in it. You don't pay extra for any of those functions. So you don't pay for the load balancing. You don't pay for the VPN functionality. You don't pay for any of the extras. So as you're designing or you're thinking about how to design, just know that you've basically got 9 interfaces that you can put 9 different networks on, but there's no, by default, routing rules between them. The static routes are created, but if you don't write a firewall rule that says test network can talk to dev network, or test network can talk to private network, nothing's going to traverse, right? The routing rules are there. The static routes are in place, but you've got to write the firewall rules. So what I said in the beginning, which is we're not admins anymore. Now we're firewall administrators as well. So let's talk a little bit about the core offering. So last year when we stood up here, we had one offering. We had infrastructure as a service. Fast forward 12 months. We now have 3. And we're going to talk about how these blend together a little bit. So we've got our infrastructure as a service, and I've put DAS up here primarily because I did a lot of work with the EUC team, and I'm going to talk about how DAS, desktop as a service, fits into this because it does run on VCloud Air. And then we'll talk a little bit about recovery as a service. And again, we'll touch on it at a high level because we go in depth on this in an entire session. And there's actually some DAS sessions as well. So here's a perfect example. I want to kind of drill into each one. So this is a good infrastructure as a service example of how we built an extended data center. This is actually running. If you have a web browser, go pull up these 2 IP addresses and you should get a view login screen or a view portal page. One of those portal pages is actually running in VCHS. It's a view security server. All right. Oh, I did it. It's on film too. It's running in VCloud Air. The other one is actually running in what we call WDC, our Wenatchee data center. That's running on vSphere. So what we actually did was in our lab that's running some desktop machines and this view security server that's public on that IP address, and we've actually got our Active Directory and our view connection server. This is an example of a packaged application. So we went out and we extended our data center. We built a VPN between the 2 sites because we can't afford direct connect. They won't give us that. We tried. But we can do everything with VPN. And then what we did is to build this truly as a hybrid application, we used Dyn.com, which is basically DNS, load balancing, all software as a service based. And we actually created our external DNS record. So if you hit these 2 independently, you'll get the 2 web portals to come up. If you actually hit view.vmtm.org, you'll get proper security certificates and all that resolution. What happens, and I think, no, I didn't put the other slide in here. It was from another presentation. But what happens is you'll get load balanced to either one of these, and because of this VPN tunnel, this is configured to know where Active Directory, the connection server, and all the desktops are. So the user doesn't know. They don't know which security server they're using. So we've effectively extended a portion of Horizon View. We're not hosting the desktops in VCloud Air in this particular example. I'll show that in another one.
$10.
Yeah, I know. So to give another good example, we built it with the View security servers. Dave actually talked about how VMware is doing it with Exchange. So there are components of Exchange that are in VCloud Air. And he's actually going to be building some of that in our lab, and then your basic web servers. So that's a good example of infrastructure as a service. So DAS, desktop as a service. This also shows up in our recovery session because we actually did some implementations where we're using DAS with hybrid data center, with recovery and DR all together in one big solution. Basically what desktop as a service is the EUC business unit, that's the Desktone acquisition, they're a VCloud Air customer, right? So they're basically running all Desktone infrastructure as a Desktone provider, and then you can go purchase desktops that they're actually managing, all running on VCloud Air. So this is actually another good example of, I wouldn't say a package solution, but it's semi-packaged because of Desktone. And then finally we have recovery as a service. So with recovery as a service, you're able to replicate virtual machines from vSphere using vSphere replication out to our cloud, right? Point, click, done. You install one appliance, you can replicate 500 virtual machines out to the cloud, down to 15-minute RPOs, up to 24 hours. We actually, and I talked about this, there was about 50 people in a group discussion this morning, we do now, from some work that we did on the tech marketing team, have a supported solution to actually do the seeding portion without downtime. So you can actually use vCloud Connector and seed your replications to cut down on the amount of replication. We'll talk a lot more about this use case in our recovery session, for sure. And then one other piece that goes with this, it's not replication, but it actually is part of infrastructure as a service. So in the infrastructure as a service offering, we do have data protection. So data protection is the ability to create backups of your virtual machines running in infrastructure as a service. So once you've got a web server out there running, we still want daily backups, right, that we can restore. So we actually have that capability, and we can actually do what we call self-service or a full virtual data center backup where every virtual machine that spins up uses a global policy. So we'll talk a lot about that. Dave's got some screenshots of it that we can show for the other session we're going to do. So now we're going to talk in depth about, it's interesting, it's only about 5 steps to do it, but there's a lot of conversation that has to happen in those 5 steps.
So, as we mentioned, we have 2 service offerings today, the dedicated cloud and the virtual private cloud. So I want to actually talk initially around how you actually size those. Sizing is very important because if you want to leverage these environments, because this is a subscription model, you buy it in bundles of compute resources. So when you look at these, a dedicated cloud, you get 30 gigahertz of CPU, you get 120 gig of RAM, and you get 6 terabytes. That's the initial bundle that you buy, and then you buy subsequent add-ons of CPU and storage, memory, and then you buy storage. Now, as I was saying about dedicated cloud, these are your own physical hosts, so you have a lot of control over these. So I want to ask you a question. How many people in the room use reservations and limits on premises today? Not that many people.
How many people know what a reservation is? Okay,
Awesome.
I'm just checking. We're at VMworld, right? We should know what a reservation is. I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page.
So how many people use resource pools?
As folders. You got to bring out the classic ones, right?
5 years
Come
ago.
on.
So resource pools are reservations and limits. Okay? So it's important to understand how the reservations and limits work. By leveraging these, you are actually setting a reservation for a virtual machine to have the resources available to it on power on. So for example, you give it 2 gig of RAM, you need 2 gig of RAM available when you power that on. So our dedicated cloud, you're able to define your reservations and limits. I want to ask another question. How many people do overcommitment on premises today?
Good.
Okay. So what kind of thresholds are you happy with? Is it 5 to 1, 10 to 1? Anyone want to shout out? You'll get a t-shirt. It depends. Great example. So it's a good answer. It depends. It depends on your workloads. If it's dev test, then who's going to worry about overcommitting 20 to 1? Not so much, because performance isn't a factor. If it's an important critical application for your business, then performance really does matter. So overcommitment isn't going to be as much of a consideration. So you can scale out a dedicated cloud as much as you want based on overcommitment. Now, we all know how overcommitment works. If you throw tons and tons and tons of VMs in there, and then eventually the hosts are swapping, then you're going to potentially eventually run into storage performance problems. So there are a lot of considerations, but again, we're trying to make a point about the considerations are the same as when you're designing your vSphere clusters. So let's take a look at the difference with a virtual private cloud. As we were saying, these are shared tenants. So how many people think we're going to let you do overcommitment on a 20 to 1 ratio in a shared tenant? No.
Oh, we get to control that one.
Yeah. So in a virtual private cloud, all the memory reservations are set to 100%. So you can't ever overcommit your memory. However, we do allow you to have a bit of overcommitment on your CPU. So as we were saying, you get 5 gigahertz of CPU, you get 20 gig of RAM, and the storage starts at 2 terabytes. But you can burst up to 10 gigahertz. So you have a bit of flexibility from a CPU perspective. So you can start thinking about the maths and how you can do that, and how you can leverage that for your workloads. When you consider going back to a dedicated cloud, potentially a dedicated cloud may give you more flexibility because of the overcommitment. Dev test again. So remember the 5 starting points we were talking about as well. So on premises, don't worry, we haven't forgot. It's very important. So we want to start talking about how you actually design those networks. And I'll give it back to Chris, because he's the resident networking expert.
I hope not. So going back to that last slide, because these were submitted before VMworld, there's a way and a tool to help you size this. Dave and I used to do this with a spreadsheet. There's a new pricing calculator on vcloud.vmware.com. I think it's on the main page, the link to it. It actually takes a lot of the calculations into consideration on the back end with some slider bars and stuff. So you can actually play with the different models and see how many virtual machines and things like that you can fit in it. So we've simplified it. Kudos to Christine Anderson and Chris Spencer and Jay Marshall for actually getting that up and running with the raw team. So when we start thinking about our networking, and I love this topic because you're going to see how things start to mirror a little bit when you're designing networks. Now, when you get your VCloud Air environment, there's no networks. Well, there's actually 2. There's 2 default ones. There's a default routed and a default isolated. I usually just tell people to wipe those out and start from scratch because I like having a clean slate to work with. So if this was our on-premises network, and this was our lab, right? We're always, actually, everything you see, we've actually done and is up and running. And if you catch us, sitting around doing nothing, which is probably rare, then we can show you some of this stuff running for real. So we actually have a couple domain controllers. We have what we call a VCloud connector node. We've got various stuff on a private network, right? On premises. Well, what we're going to do is we actually happen to have an edge device in WDC. I was able to actually get some public IPs and some real internet access for this environment. And then we can talk about our 2 clouds. They could be dedicated or private. It doesn't matter in this case. And we're going to have an external IP on that edge gateway. Well, if you were going back to the first slide when I said think about this as a physical data center, what's the first thing you do when you build a new data center? What's that? WAN links, right? You got to connect them. Well, that's after you build it, put the block in, the slab. All right, well, we won't do the whole how do you build a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. We got to network them. So what are some of our considerations? Well, we got to go back. All right, I have 9 interfaces. So how do I want to use those 9 interfaces? Do I want to use all 9? Do I need 3? Do I need 4? How many do I need? What am I going to use for my IP addressing in those? So if you're using VPN, You probably aren't going to mimic your same IP range that you have on premises because IPsec VPN tunnels won't come up if the peer endpoints are identical. If you're using direct connect, different story, right? You can actually, that's already going to be a different layer 3 connection. So in our case, we used VPN. We've got to think about all the firewall rules, right? Because remember what I said before. I can establish the connectivity. I can establish the VPN tunnel, but if I don't write the rules that says point A is allowed to talk to point B, I'm not going to have any traffic pass. What's the impact of my current environment? How am I going to move my templates to the cloud? We'll talk about that, actually. And then what other networks might I need? So these are the things you want to think about, and you've got this blank whiteboard, and you actually want to start drawing this out on what your networks are going to look like in the cloud. So for our purposes, we built what we call the public network, which is essentially our DMZ. We created our corporate network, and that's all we started with. And the reason we did that was because we knew we wanted to have some infrastructure on the quote-unquote corporate network, and we wanted some web servers and stuff public-facing. Then what we have to do, somebody threw it out there, we have to establish the WAN connectivity. So in this case, we used VPN, right? Really simple to set up. We made sure we write the firewall rules for it, or we can do direct connect if we wanted to. So once these actually come up, I'm going to ask everybody again. So once you have your network, or you got your building, you got your power, you got your networks, what's the first thing you usually put in your new data center? What's that? Domain controller, right? You need authentication, DNS, like probably some other stuff, right? I was in architectural engineering for a long time, believe it or not, before I was in IT. I had this little professor who was German, and he always just talked about stuff. You just always need stuff. But you got to put something on that corporate network. So what do? We put our domain controllers out there, right? We put some app servers out there. We put some infrastructure that's going to support that site. How many people use Active Directory sites and services? Properly. Right? Well, this is another site. I'm always going to come back to it's no different than a physical data center. You set up new networks, you add those networks to sites and services, you call this a new site in AD. And because you've actually made the WAN connectivity in between, you're going to be able to replicate your Active Directory information between them. Then what we actually did is we stood up some external DNS and some external SMTP relays, web servers, things like that. So, now, where are we at? We're only on step 4, really. We kind of like mucked around with step 3 a little bit. But you start to see where this is going? Does this look like cloud, or does this just look like building another data center?
So there's an
Wait, I heard
point.
somebody say something. Yeah? Another data center? All right.
So what Chris was saying as well is, and it's kind of important when you're looking at this, is people seem to think that you can just spin up your resources in the cloud and off you go. The reason why we're showing you this from a kind of infrastructure resource perspective is if you're going to start doing your authentication over a VPN back and forth, say you move all your applications out to the cloud and you've got your AD on premises and it's all authenticating nicely, but you've set an IPsec VPN up, what's going to happen when all these applications want authentication?
How many of you got, folks? Yeah, how many folks have a campus? Or multiple physical data centers, right? Does all your traffic go back to corporate for authentication? No, right? It might sound rudimentary, but I've been having this talk for like 2 years. And I think people are starting to finally see where I'm trying to explain this, and Dave's trying to explain this, right? You just have to take the blue pill. Which one is it? Is the blue pill or the red pill? I can never remember.
I can't remember. I must have watched that movie like 50 times.
Exactly.
Well. But it's a very valid point, because you need to understand, and it's going back to that original point that Chris made, it's another site. So, do you want to repeat after me? It's another site.
We should have had t-shirts made up. Just said, it's another site.
Yeah.
Oh, go back again?
Are you drawing it?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Just take a picture of it, man. Lasts longer. Wow.
Do I use my
He's
phone?
got sketches going. We just give him a t-shirt because he's drawing the damn thing.
Yeah, you can have a t-shirt.
You don't want to know how long it took Dave to do these animations, okay? It's a lot of overlays. So, and one thing we want to show is you'll notice we represent these stacks a little bit differently. And how many people notice sort of this cloud of clouds over on the dedicated side? Well, it's really cool, because what you could do in a dedicated cloud is you get that big chunk of 120 gigs of RAM and 30 gigahertz of CPU. You, as the tenant, actually can create multiple virtual data centers within that cloud, each with their own edge gateway, or gateways, each with their own applications running. right? So in our tenant, we have one of these big dedicated clouds, and we have tech marketing tenant, VDC, we've got a testing VDC, we've got a demo VDC, so we've taken all those resources and we carved them up into individual pockets of resources so we can isolate and control the resources within it. You can't do that on virtual private cloud. You actually stack it vertically, right? So you get one virtual private cloud. If you want more resources, we add more resources to it. It goes from 20 gigs RAM to 40 to 60 to 80, right? But it's still the same virtual data center. Follow? So you can actually create multiple virtual data centers that are dedicated. What that also means when you go back to that pricing model is a lot of people think that dedicated cloud's more expensive when they're designing it, but because you can do overcommitment and maybe you can put, I don't know, how many VMs and 120 gigs of RAM if you're overcommitting?
A lot.
A lot, right? I think our poor labs get like 60 VMs on 2 hosts or something.
Performance is irrelevant for our lab. It's just
right.
You will die.
So think about that. Your price per virtual machine is relative. I had this conversation with a customer up in New England, and when we were working on sizing it, and they were looking to go to cloud, it actually dedicated ended up being cheaper long term because it was test dev workloads, and they were going to put a ton of workload in there and just overcommit all of it, right? Because it's that reservation challenge. So then what do? Well, all right, you got your first infrastructure as a service. Well, now you can start to expand further with the different offerings. All we've been talking about is infrastructure as a service, and how do you do that? Well, you start connecting the dots, literally. You basically take your infrastructure as a service that we have up in Las Vegas, and we actually did our IPsec VPN down to WDC, which is running straight vSphere. Then we stood up our DAS infrastructure, right? Those three offerings that I was talking about. So we have our DAS virtual data center, and you'll notice that's also connected back to on-premises through VPN because we want these desktops to be able to talk to any applications that are on-premises, right? Makes sense. You got users going to DAS. Maybe you don't have Horizon. Maybe you're going straight DAS. We also, if you'll notice, have our DAS environment and our dedicated infrastructure environment connected to our recovery environment. Why? Oh, whoa. Somebody said it. I heard it, right? What's that? No, you don't want to recover the desktops, but you need your desktops, well, you have it connected because if you fail over an application, now the desktops can connect to it, right? Because this is gone. So if that disappears, your desktops are still on the cloud. They can still get to the application. We've already pre-connected those two environments with either VPN or Direct Connect.
You get a T-shirt because you were halfway there.
Yeah, we'll give you a T-shirt. And what else do our applications need when we fail them over? Authentication, some DNS, some of that same infrastructure stuff we were talking about. Who likes to replicate domain controllers? I asked that question in the morning. There's always one guy in the middle who raises his hand. Dave, I asked Dave if he wanted to test that, and he just said no. Right? Well, it's interesting. When we talk about our DR offering tomorrow, there's some limitations to it. We can't run real-time virtual machines in that. They're placeholders because they're replications. They're not actual virtual machines, and you can't spin up a new virtual machine. However, if you're building this the way we're suggesting, you already have that infrastructure in that other cloud. You just connect the dots. Right? We call it a cloud-to-cloud VPN, but it's just an IPsec tunnel between the two clouds. So this can get extremely, extremely complicated and complex as you start to design it out. We're not talking about just one cloud with a VPN tunnel and a bunch of applications running. So how complex can it get? I don't really do anything small for people who know me. So how many of you guys, folks, build something just to see if you can do it? Okay, right? Okay, so this is our lab because our manager, Jenny, gave us some money. And I said, I want to go build some stuff. Jenny. Yeah, she's in the audience. But I said, I want to see if we could build something of an Uber architecture, right? Build an actual hybrid data center across multiple clouds, everything. So this is what we have. We have one physical site, that's it. We have WDC. And in WDC, we have vSphere running, and that's it for 3 or 4 hosts, some VNX storage on the back end. And this is what we have. We have 3 virtual private clouds, one for recovery as a service in Dallas, one for infrastructure as a service in Sterling, Virginia, another one for infrastructure as a service in Las Vegas. We then have 2 dedicated clouds, one for infrastructure as a service, one for desktop as a service. So we're spreading the load. We used IPsec VPN everywhere. I called my friends at Dyn.com, who I used to work with in another life, and said, can I get a demo account because I need to do some DNS and load balancing stuff? Sure. So I put their name on the slide. And that's actually our domain. So we actually registered a domain called VMTM, which stands for VMware Tech Marketing.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Hack it, please.
Yeah, we just wanted something short, so we didn't have to type like, you know, gohere.com. So now we're going to build this out. So we started with our Wenatchee data center, WDC. Then what we added was our dedicated clouds and our infrastructure as a service. So this is all the infrastructure as a service pieces. And every one of these infrastructure as a service clouds is at a minimum running Active Directory. Then what we added was our DAS cloud for desktop as a service and our recovery cloud. So we can actually do replication of applications. We actually have some videos that we've produced failing over a web server and some other stuff. This here, don't focus on that. That's just how DAS works. There's like a provider VDC and then a tenant VDC, and talk to me afterwards. I learned a whole bunch of stuff about how Desktone works. Then we did all of that. Now, if I actually printed the firewall rules for that, you'd go blind. What's that? It's about, yeah, it's quite a list, right? And there was a lot of testing involved to make sure everything was working and all the Active Directory was replicating and everything was happening. But what does it allow us to do in this lab that Chris got to build just because he wanted to see if he could make it work? We're able to do pretty much everything from a use case perspective. We have a web server running that we use for our DR examples that we fail over with a public IP address, www.vmtm.org. You'll get a little web page, and we have a failed over version of that running in the DR environment. And we've actually worked with F5 as well as Dyn to do some global load balancing stuff. We've then got our view environment where we actually, there's a 3-part series that's on the VCloud blog that we put together that actually talks about how you can use desktop as a service and redirect users from the view environment with the same client without them knowing and actually send them through DAS and Desktone to get to the recovered VMs. This is kind of cool because it's not just one thing, like one point click, you know, stand up a VM, yeah, the lights are on, cool. No, this is actually some stuff that we threw up in a very large lab to actually show live demos and things like that. So, and here you can see actually where the differences between, where we don't have cloud-to-cloud VPNs everywhere. It's only in specific places where we need it, right? So we only have, you know, our desktops are connected to here and down here, and then the dedicateds are connected. Question?
So, yeah, I want to ask a question. If you wanted to do this physically, how expensive do you think it would be?
Exactly. How long would it take?
Yeah.
Anybody want to take a stab how long it took me to do that? 3 years. Who said 3 years? All right, we might give you a T-shirt just for being a wise guy.
And the other point to note is, as much as we love our manager Jenny, she isn't that rich, so there is no way in the world we could do this physically. So we don't have the budget to do that, certainly for a lab. You imagine going to your manager for build all that physically as a lab environment? They'd probably slap you.
I will actually tell all of you that I sat down on a Monday. That was built by Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
Did you get up?
Yeah, I actually ate too. I worked out. Yeah, I slept. Yeah, it wasn't a lot of work. I mean, most of the work, to be honest, most of the work was tracking all the firewall rules. That was probably the most mind-numbing part, right? Because the different IP addresses and the different subnets that I needed to make sure communicated. Because for anybody who knows me really well, I'm a little type A, just a little bit, little bit, right? So when this environment got built, like it's not any on any of those firewall rules. It's very specific. Like desktop can talk to here, and this can talk to that. It's not wide open because we want to be able to show that you can control it. You have all that capability within the firewalls to do that. So really, really cool stuff. And we got some more videos coming out of this lab. Dave's, like I said, Dave's going to throw up a small Exchange environment and some other stuff in there so that he can actually, you know, do it on an environment that we control.
Question.
Questions?
There's more detailed information on exactly how you did it if anyone wants to try and reproduce it.
Yeah, actually, the most detailed information is the 3-part blog series on the VCloud blog. So it doesn't have all the nitty-gritty ins and outs. Like I didn't draw up like a whole how-to guide, but a lot of the information's in there for sure. Question?
I just want to make sure I understand from your physical data center, what's the minimum licensing requirement? You just need vSphere and vCenter, or do you need any other licensing or VMware product
Great question. So we'll repeat the question. And before you leave, I love doing that. Just make sure you fill out your surveys if you're taking off early. That's all we ask.
Surveys are important.
Yeah, they're really
so
important.
We know how we can change this for the future.
Because we actually have a repeat of this, so if there's stuff you think other people will benefit from, we'll take the notes. So thank you. With this, the only thing that's required is your on-premises vSphere licensing, right, for your on-prem, and then a subscription or, part of the beta. So if you actually sign up for the beta of on-demand, all of the same functionality we've talked about from an edge gateway and all that networking exists in on-demand exactly the same. So the only other requirement is to have either a subscription or on-demand beta or some access to VCloud Air. So there's no licensing for the VPN. It's included. It's all IPsec based. There's no licensing for the load balancing. The Dyn stuff was like separate. That was a favor I called in. So yeah, there's no specifics. No, VCloud Director is not required on premises.
But can I just make that point? So we actually do get asked that question a lot. To do this, do we need VCloud Director? No, you don't.
That's why we built it on just vSphere in the lab. We have no VCD in the lab.
The whole future of your private cloud is all vSphere based. You can do all this just with vSphere and a VCloud Air subscription. So you've been holding your hand up for ages, the guy at the back.
So I will answer that and I won't be biased. I couldn't get the damn thing working. And I'll tell you why. I'll actually be honest, because the way this environment is set up, I don't want to use the term nested, but because we have some corporate infrastructure and we have some public infrastructure, I had no way to actually run Active Directory Federation services. So without Active Directory Federation services, I couldn't get the AWS plugin for vSphere up and running. And that's a requirement of it. So it was the way the lab is actually built. I couldn't expose the AD that we were using because it was on the corporate network, and that would have got me in trouble with security people, and then I wouldn't have a job and be able to talk to you. So it's actually not biased. I couldn't do it. I just physically couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Question in the back. Yeah, so his question, and I think we have mics too, so if you have a question, since they're recording the session, it'd be great if you can come up.
Questions you want to
or we'll send Vic to run around with a microphone, but I don't think we have a wireless one.
Yeah.
Is there any network guys in the room?
We love you.
Yes, to a point it was a little bit sort of cut and paste. I mean, I had to figure out the first set of rules that I wanted to write, and then I just basically kept a sheet to keep my brain straight as to what I was doing. But I mean, I had different IP addresses for the endpoints for the VPNs, and I had different peer endpoints for the internal NATed networks. But the rules were the same. So yeah, I basically just reproduced the rules once I knew what I was working with. But yeah, this guy's had his hand up forever, so let me just. Great question. So did I just have to use vCenter? No. I use obviously vSphere Web Client on premises, and I was used mostly the VCloud Air portal and the plugin, and you do have to use the VCD interface. You have to jump out because you can't, in VCloud Air today, you can't configure the VPN tunnels through the regular portal. So there is a little bit of complexity there, but we're both ex-VCD guys, so bouncing between wasn't a big deal.
It's a great question as well, because we do have and I'm going to use its official term because it's not been rebranded yet, the VCHS plugin that goes into the vSphere Web Client.
Right.
And then you can manage your workloads out in VCloud Air from the same pane of glass that you're doing with your on-premises environment.
Right.
So you don't have to keep jumping to different web browsers and things.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
For me, it was like personal preference. You could also do a lot of it with VCO or other tools. Chris doesn't code, so I'm
going to let this guy go first because he went to the mic.
Yeah.
So in terms of acquiring public address space, so if I wanted to host an external facing site in a cloud, is that something that I would buy, or would I use my own corporate address space and route it through the VPN?
When you get when you get a subscription, you get either 2 or 3 public IP addresses. So it's 2 with VPC, it's 3 with dedicated. So we actually have a public IP space, so you use those if you want to use our internet connection. You can then choose to route traffic differently. We've got a couple of diagrams in different sessions we use on how you can route traffic back to on-premises and out through corporate infrastructure, like your existing IDS and firewalls.
So if you actually want to know more about how you do that routing
whole
through your
networking
own
session.
premises session, then I've got a networking session with the product manager on Wednesday, I think. So the networking deep dive with VCloud Air.
Yeah, they'll dive right into that
we'll
use
talk
case.
about how you can do all that as well.
And then a quick second one. There is only layer 3 VPN. You don't support layer 2.
It's layer 2 within the same interface,
Yeah.
but layer 3 across interfaces.
Yeah, but not. I can't extend I can't take a VLAN in my corporate environment and try to extend it into the VCloud.
Kinda. It's called Datacenter extension.
Oh, okay.
Whole different conversation.
Yeah.
I was really hoping you'd say.
Again-
Actually, I was hoping
again,
you'd say no, but
Come to the networking session and we'll answer that question for
Network
you.
guys always want us to say no to that question.
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
in the back.
So is there any version that we have to be on for this all to work, especially for the VR part of it?
For the disaster recovery part of it, yes, you have to be running, we have the requirements in our other session, but vSphere 5.1, Essentials Plus at a minimum or above gets you the license for the replication appliance.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you,
Edge gateway, do you have to use the VMware Edge gateway? Can you use another?
that's a great question. So again, come to the networking session. I'll talk more about it, but I will answer that question.
I did
So-
some work with F5 that I gave you some slides for. So.
I'm not going to go into massive detail, but what you can actually do is the Edge gateway, you essentially put it into pass-through mode, and then you can bring something like a F5, connect that in, and then create all your networks under that, and then you can kind of export all your rules from on-premises out to your F5. But I'll go into a lot more detail on that in the network.
Surveys! Just letting you know.
It's the
Surveys.
VCloud Air networking technical deep dive session. Catch me afterwards and I'll give you the session number. I can't
Go
remember.
back one slide.
Thank you.